There's a place where streams of grace flow deep and wide. All the love I've ever found, 'cause like a flood comes flowing down. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in all of you. I'm in all of you. Where your love red, and my sin washed white. I owe to you. I owe to you, Jesus. There's a place where sin and shame are powerless. Where my heart has peace with God, forgiveness. Where all the love I've ever found, 'cause like a flood is flowing down. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in all of you. I'm in all of you. Where your love red, and my sin was white. I owe to you. I owe to you. Here, my hope is found. Here, on holy ground. Here, I bow down. Here, I bow. Here, arms open wide. Here, you saved my life. Here, I bow down. Here, I bow. Here, my hope is found. Here, on holy ground. Here, I bow. Here, and here, arms open wide. Here, you saved my life. Here, I bow down. Here, I bow. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in all of you. I'm in all of you. Where your love red, and my sin was white. I owe to you. I owe to you. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in all of you, Lord. I'm in all of you. Where your love red, and my sin was white. I owe to you. I owe to you. I owe to you, Jesus. I owe to you. I owe to you. I owe to you, Jesus. Above all power, above all king, above all nature, and all created things, above all wisdom and all the ways of man. Lord, you were here before the world began. Above all kingdoms, above all thrones, above all wonders the world has ever known. rejected and alone, like a rose, trembled on the ground. You took the fall and thought of me above all powers, above all powers, above all kings, above all nature and all created things, above all wisdom and all the ways of man. Lord, you were here before the world began. Above all kingdoms, above all thrones, above all wonders the world has ever known, above all wealth and treasures of the earth, there's no way to measure what you're worth. Crucified, laid behind the stone, lived to die, rejected and alone, like a rose, trampled on the ground. You took the fall, you thought of me above all. Crucified, laid behind the stone, lived to die, rejected and alone, like a rose, trampled on the ground. You took the fall and thought of me above all, like a rose, trampled on the ground. Yeah, you took the fall, thought of me above all. Hallelujah.
Matthew 27 from verse 1, it says, "Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor." Verse 3, "When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. 'I have sinned,' he said, 'for I have betrayed innocent blood.' 'What is that to us?' they replied. 'It's your responsibility.' So Judas threw the money into the temple and left, and then he went away and hanged himself. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me." Verse 11, "Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' 'You have said so,' Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, 'Don't you hear the testimony they bring in against you?' But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" for he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. I want you to note that phrase. Pilate, the authority, knew that it was out of self-interest. He was not ignorant. It's something you can just read over and perhaps miss there for a moment. Verse 19, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. Don't have anything to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. Which of the two do you want me to release? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? Pilate asked. They all answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and he washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It's your responsibility. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. It's a phrase you can just pass over. But here, these people sat and watched him. Above his head was placed the written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God. In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we will believe him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, I am the Son of God. In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Here it gets interesting. Verse 45, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. Luke says the whole earth. About 3 in the afternoon, that's after the darkness, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those weren't just random words that came out of his mouth. He was quoting from one of the Psalms, for your information. When some of those who heard, they said, he's calling Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge and filled it with wine vinegar and put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. Listen carefully to this. At that moment, the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook. The rocks split, the tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. As the evening approached, verse 57, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. He has no negotiation. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, one of the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate and said, "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days he will rise again.' So give the order that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. Isn't it a remarkable story? You know, sometimes we've just got to read these stories, because sometimes we've just heard drips and drabs, and we must read it for ourselves. It must become a reality. And then we realize it's only the end of the beginning. And I noticed a couple of things. Firstly, that Jesus died in a very public way. He died in a very public way. There was nothing hidden. There was nothing concealed. It was very public, in the open, on a hill, in broad daylight, for everybody to see. It was very, very public what he went through. Nowadays, in countries where they still practice the death penalty, it's done in seclusion. It's done behind closed doors. This was not done like that. In fact, they sat and watched it like some kind of spectacle. And it was very public. And I suppose it was done like that to compel people to be submissive. I'm not too sure. But imagine if it had been done in isolation. Imagine if no one had seen it. But everybody saw it. The authorities saw it. The priests saw it. The family saw it. The friends saw it. And you know, there's been many queries about the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And did he actually rise from the dead? And many people who are skeptics, who are not sure and this. But there's one thing that's never been questioned, and that was, who was actually on the cross? Wasn't questioned. Why? Because everybody could see it was done in public. In the broad daylight, running up to 12 noon. And it was very, very public. The second thing I see is this amazing celestial miracle. This miracle that happens when the darkness comes. And it says from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. Now this must have shocked even the hardest-hearted people. You must remember in those days there wasn't electricity. There wasn't the generator and your daylight switch and all these kind of things. It would have been dark. And here, probably the people would have stopped working. Probably everything would have stopped. Probably there was fear because there'd been these earthquakes and there'd been all this that's going on. And probably people were groping around trying to find out where they were and trying to get to where they needed to be. And probably it was a stillness probably came over. And it was this darkness that came over. And it was at the brightest time of the day, when the sun was directly overhead, when shadows are at their shortest. And sometimes we can overlook this. But it was dramatic, it was out of the ordinary, and it was borderline scary. And it really made what was happening on Calvary everybody's problem, because everybody became aware of it. And I want to tell you, midnight in the middle of the day is only something God can do. And sometimes we only associate God with good things. He's benevolent. But He's a God of righteousness and justice. And it was God who brought the darkness. I believe Jesus is God, and it was He who brought the darkness. And if He can bring the celestial miracle in the worst time of His suffering, and He can attend to that, surely He can attend to your need. But the crucifixion couldn't go unnoticed because there were all these things going on. It couldn't go unnoticed. Now some people, by the way, in the book of Luke it says the sun stopped shining. It's more specific. It says the sun stopped shining. Now some people say, oh, it was an eclipse. And I suppose you could almost reason that. But I want to tell you a couple of reasons why it cannot be that. One is that Passover is usually celebrated around the time of full moon. You cannot have full moon and an eclipse at the same time. Any of you who've studied geography will know that that's not possible. The light that an eclipse creates is basically a subdued lighting. One can't really call it darkness. And when I went and researched it, I found the longest an eclipse can ever last is 7 minutes and 31 seconds, and it's usually shorter. So it was impossible, and that makes it a miracle. That makes it a miracle, and you might be sitting here and thinking, well, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe that's where the problem starts. Let me remind you of the words of Jesus when he said in Mark 10:27, with man this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God. The third point is that the light departed. It was dark. The physical light of the sun was removed, and this took these things to a completely new level. Something was playing out in the heavens that was a reflection of what was playing out on the earth in a spiritual way. And the Bible does say the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. Here we have 3 hours of darkness, and we have Jesus in the grave for 3 days. We have this parallel, this example, and we see the light of the earth going out, and then we see the light of the world dying. Jesus said, He is the light of the world. That word world is different from the light, the darkness that covered the earth. The darkness that covered the earth was referring to the world in which we live. The light of the world speaks of the cosmos. And so we have a situation here where the light was removed. It was taken away. To all intent and purpose, it died. And it's almost as if something of God's greatness is revealed in all this. And at the darkest moment in history, not only did the earth's light, the sun, depart, but the light of the world died. And therein lay the real tragedy. You see, just as the earth cannot survive without the light of the sun, so you and I cannot survive without the light of the sun in our lives. We need Him. Without the light of the sun on the earth, nothing would survive. And without His light in our hearts, we can be physically alive, but dead in every other way. But the joy was, point 4, the light returned. The light returned. It's a beautiful story. And it's interesting to note, if you go and read the timing, that it was after the darkness, when the light returned physically, that Jesus died. It's an interesting one there. You can go and read it in Matthew 27 from verse 45, because it says, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried in a loud voice. And then it says He gave up His spirit. So part of His suffering was in darkness. Part of His suffering was in public, in the full blaze of the sun. But part of His suffering was in darkness. I don't know if you've been through it, maybe somebody here you've been through a difficult time, and no one really knows what you went through. Can anybody identify with that? Not even your spouse. And I want to tell you, there's an aspect of Jesus' suffering that is shrouded in darkness. We will never grasp it. We will never understand it. We will never come to terms with it. It wasn't observed. Probably it was the worst, because the 3 hours prior to death were surely the worst hours. Ah, must have been. But the wonderful thing is that the physical light came back, and then Jesus died, and then 3 days later, the light of the world rose again. The light of the world rose again. And that to me is the most remarkable thing. The light was restored. And when we see all that had happened, and we see the wonderful miracle of the light of the world being restored, it is so great that the issues of earthquakes, darkness, curtains being torn, rocks exploding, dead coming up from the grave, don't compare. And we can just brush over them because the miracle is so great that all those things fall into perspective. But of course those things will happen. Of course those things are going to happen because the miracle was so great. We don't even need to worry about those things because the miracle is so great. As I share the last point, and my question is, when we see the magnitude of the miracles and the miracle that took place, we can just stand amazed. But is there something we must do? Is there something from our side? Well, I believe there's many things, but one of the things is just to say thank you. You see, sometimes we think of saying thank you. It's like when we say grace at the table. Lord, thank you for this food. Thank you for dying for me. Bless the dog. Amen. It must be more than that. There must come a moment where, like in the darkness of those 3 hours when the whole world came to a standstill, and here you sit 2,000 years later, you've come to this place, you're sitting still, you're thinking about these things. There comes this moment where we can say, thank you. Not just out of our heads, but out of our very hearts and out of our very beings, thank you.